You ever have one of those days that just changes everything? Not in some dramatic movie way. No explosions. No sirens. Just one small moment that flips your whole world upside down. Mine started with a letter. It was a quiet Tuesday morning. Sun barely up. Sky painted that kind of dull orange that makes everything feel slow. I was sitting on my porch like I did every morning with a steaming cup of black coffee in my hand. The old rocking chair creaked under me, same one my dad built 40 years ago. The world felt still, peaceful even. Then I heard the gravel crunching under tires. Old Mike, the mailman, pulled up in his rusty white van. "Morning, Walter," he called out. "Got something from downtown for you. Looks important." He gave me a friendly nod, tossed a thick brown envelope onto my table, and drove off. I didn't think much of it until I saw the name printed on the corner. Henderson and Moore Legal Associates. My heart just dropped. That was my father's law firm, the one that handled all his affairs. And right then, I knew exactly what that envelope was. Dad's will. I just sat there, staring at it, didn't open it right away. The edges were crisp, sealed tight, like it was guarding a secret I wasn't sure I wanted to know. 2 months had passed since Dad died, and not a day went by that I didn't miss the old man. He wasn't perfect, and God knows we butted heads plenty, but he was honest, steady, the kind of man whose word was worth more than a signature. So yeah, part of me thought maybe this envelope would bring closure. Maybe it'd help me move on. But that's the funny thing about life. Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes it breaks you. I tore it open. The papers were neatly stacked, but official, coldly impersonal. At the top, it said, "Last Will and Testament of Robert E. Hayes." I scanned through the legal jargon. Bequeath, transfer, executor. Then I saw it. One line that changed everything. All property, assets and holdings are to be transferred solely to Franklin D. Hayes. I blinked. No, that had to be a mistake. I read it again, slower this time, but it didn't change. The words were still there, cold and final. Franklin D. Hayes, my brother. My hands started shaking. My chest tightened like a fist had wrapped around my heart. Dad and I had talked plenty of times about the land, the farm, the old house. He said it was going to be ours and shared, me and Frank both, so how could this be? I flipped through every page looking for my name, for anything. Nothing, not a mention, not a word, just Frank's name. Over and over, my throat went dry. The coffee I'd been drinking turned sour in my mouth, and then it hit me. Frank must have done something. He had to have. I could almost see his smug grin, the one he used to flash when he thought he'd outsmarted everyone. I whispered, my voice barely a sound. "You stole it. You really stole everything, Frankie." The wind picked up, rustling the papers on my table. One of them slid off and drifted into the dirt. And just like that, it was as if everything my father built, everything I'd worked for, was blown away too. That was the day my old world ended, the day trust died, and something darker took its place. I didn't know it then, but that was also the day I started down a road that would change me forever. Because when someone steals your legacy, your blood, you don't just walk away. You make them remember who they betrayed. Frank and I grew up in a town so small the speed limit sign felt like a welcome mat. Folks knew your name before you even finished introducing yourself. Our place sat just outside Kansas City. Not the city proper, but close enough that you could smell the bus fumes on a bad day, and far enough that the sky stretched like a blanket over fields and trees. Dad called that stretch of land Hayes Valley, and he meant it. To him, it was more than acreage, man. It was the ledger of our lives. 200 acres is a lot when you're a kid. Half of it was neat, waving wheat that turned golden in August. The other half thick with oak and shadows where we used to hide and play until our clothes were filthy and Mom had to scrub the dirt out by hand. There was a pond with a willow tree that leaned like it was listening to secrets. There was a barn Dad built the summer he turned 50, with a loft that smelled of hay and honeyed sunlight. That place held the sound of our boots on the porch steps, the echo of Dad's laugh, and every scraped knee and triumphant shout we ever made. Those acres weren't just dirt. They were memory stacked on memory. We learned to fish off the old dock. Frank would show off pretending he didn't care, then grin when he pulled up the biggest sunfish. We raced bikes down the gravel lane, barrels of speed and wind, daring each other to go faster across the sharp dip by Old Man Larkin's fence. We built fences when we were supposed to be in school under Dad's watchful eye. He'd hand us the hammer and say, "Measure twice, boys. Don't let pride fix what carelessness breaks." He taught us to respect the land, and the land taught us patience. When you work soil with your hands, you learn to wait for things. The crop, the rain, the right time to say sorry. Dad had this way of talking that stuck words like seeds. He'd sit on the porch swing with a mason jar of sweet tea and tell us slow and steady, "One day, boys, this land'll be yours. Both of yours." He wasn't grand with speeches, never was, but when he said something, it carried weight. He meant that we would look after the place together, like a promise tied between two brothers. Frank was 5 years older than me. He had that grin that could convince the judge to go easy, and the PTA to fund the school picnic. People liked Frank. He charmed waitresses into giving extra fries. He charmed the minister into playing an extra hymn. He charmed businessmen into signing papers with a pen that smelled like cologne and optimism. He had a polish about him, suits, a laugh that always sounded practiced but warm, and a handshake that left you thinking, "I can trust this man." Me? I was the quiet one. I preferred hands to speeches. I fixed the tractor when it coughed and died. I knew when the hens were off their feed. I could tell by the feel of a tire when it needed air. I was the kind of man who woke up before the sun, went to work, and came home tired in a way that felt useful. I was the one who stayed to patch the roof when a storm tore shingles loose at night. I patched things because it mattered, not because anyone applauded. You'd think those differences would make room for grudges, for a rift. But blood's blood. We cut the same teeth and cursed the same weather. We shared a humor that only brothers get. Those half-word jokes that leave strangers confused and us laughing like idiots. Frank would show off and I'd roll my eyes, but we'd share the same coffee when the morning chores lined up. We were, for as long as I can remember, a team. When Dad first got sick, it didn't feel real. It crept in slow, forgetfulness here, an odd cough there, until one winter morning it was all of a sudden real and stubborn. He'd been a mountain, and then a mountain started losing pebbles. I left my job more often. I started spending whole days at the house cooking for him, wiping his brow, making sure he took pills on time. I sat through the long silences when the TV murmured and his eyes would wander like he was looking for a moment he couldn't find. Frank. He showed up in bursts. He'd come down for Sunday dinner in a suit that still smelled like a plane cabin, a smile polished for the room. He'd talk about meetings, about partnerships, about expanding, words that landed in the kitchen like they were part of some other life. After a visit, he'd leave a stack of business cards on the counter and promise to take care of things. He'd hug Dad and promise again, always with that same tidy smile. But the visits were short. He'd be gone the next morning with a wave and a note about busy weeks. He'd call twice a week and ask about Dad's medical update like someone checking stock prices. I never questioned him. Why would I? He had always been the one with a plan. He was my brother, and family has a way of smothering suspicion with duty. When I sat at Dad's bedside, rubbing the back of his hand, I told myself it was okay that Frank was doing what he did. He was providing, wasn't he? Chalk it up to different ways of helping. I told myself I was the one keeping him company, and that was enough. A few nights before Dad passed, the three of us sat on the back steps after supper. The cicadas were loud enough to hum with, and the sky was that deep blue you get just before midnight. Dad had a cough that rattled like an old screen door. He was thinner than I remembered, but his eyes were the same, still bright when he smiled. He reached out and grabbed my hand, my fingers in his like two logs in a steadying fire. "Walter," he said, voice softer than his cough, "promise me one thing. Don't let greed break what I built. You know how some words land so heavy you can feel them sink into your bones? That was one of them." I looked at Frank, expecting to see the same quiet understanding. He gave the small nod, quick like a practiced move. A smile flicked across his face that I couldn't read. It was brief enough I almost missed it. Maybe it was nerves, maybe it was comfort. I couldn't tell. "I promise," I said. It felt like a thing you could hold, like a handshake with the past. I promised him with everything I had, my voice thick and sure. That promise wasn't just to Dad. It was to myself. To the boy who ran barefoot through those fields. To the man who fixed fences and watched storms roll in. To the idea that some things were too sacred to be traded for a ledger balance or a handshake over coffee. I meant it. Frank, he already had other plans. There are gestures you notice only later. The brief glance at a ledger. The way a man pats his wallet when he thinks no one's looking. Maybe at the time those gestures felt harmless. Maybe Dad saw only a son doing what he thought necessary. I, of course, gave Frank the benefit of the doubt. I wanted to believe the best. That's how love works. It blinds you when you need it to most. But promises have a way of weighing on you. When they are kept, they make you proud and keep your hands busy. When they're broken, the ache of it settles in quiet ways, like a drip in a roof that no one notices until the plaster stains. And so it was. That night, as the porch light hummed and the road went silent, I squeezed Dad's hand and felt that old ledger of our lives shuffle beneath my skin. I couldn't know then how that promise would be tested, or how badly it would be broken. Two weeks after the funeral, the house still felt too big and too quiet. The rooms held shadows of Dad, his chair in the corner, a coat on the peg that smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco, even though he hadn't smoked in years. I'd been trying to find a rhythm again, but grief has this way of stretching time out thin so every minute is the same as the last. That's probably why I agreed to meet Mr. Henderson at his office that morning, anything to get out of the house and away from the walls that kept whispering memories. Mr. Henderson's office sat above a little bakery on Main Street. You could smell coffee and cinnamon rolls through the vents, small comforts. He was an old man, too, with a suit that still fit like it had been made to carry decades of honest work. He'd been our family lawyer for as long as I could remember. He'd watched me and Frank get scolded as children and later signed the papers when Dad bought the acreage. He'd always been gentle, like someone who knows that legal words can break more than just contracts. When I walked in, he stood up slowly and gave me that look folks give when they don't quite know the right way to begin. He folded his hands, cleared his throat like he was bracing against the wind, and I could tell the words were heavy in his chest. "Walter," he said, voice low. "Your father's will. It was revised about 3 months before his passing. I remember thinking he was talking about a small change, maybe a bank account moved or a charity name updated. But then he said the words I'd feared without even knowing. Everything, he added, the land, the house, the business, has been transferred to your brother Franklin." For a second the room tilted. The coffee on his desk steamed up toward the ceiling like it knew the air was about to get colder. I blinked hard, like if I blinked enough the world might right itself. "That's impossible," I said before I could stop myself. "Dad wouldn't do that. Not without telling me." Mr. Henderson looked at me, pity softening his features. "I understand, son, but I have his signed documents here." He slid a folder across the desk like it was something fragile. The paper inside was crisp and official, typed language with signatures at the bottom. I felt my hands go a little numb as I reached for them. You never expect legal paper to feel so much like a coffin lid. At first glance it read like any other will. Names, bequests, executors. But the last page held the sentence that made my stomach hollow out. "All property, real and personal, shall be transferred solely to Franklin D. Hayes, to be held and managed at his discretion." My name was nowhere. My father's promise, both of yours, was reduced to legal ink and wiped clean. I stared at the signature. Dad had always signed his name with a certain flourish, an old habit from when men used to put pride into pen strokes. His R had a loop that swooped like the tail of a kite, his E always tilted like a little bow. This signature, it looked hurried. The loops were tight, cramped, like someone trying to sketch it from memory. The pressure on the paper wasn't even. It didn't feel like Dad's hand. I scanned the date. It was dated the week Dad had been admitted to the hospital. The same week the doctor had told us he was fragile and needed rest. A strangled laugh escaped me then, because that was the week he could barely hold a cup of tea without blinking through the pain. "You're telling me," I said slowly. Each word a flat stone dropped into a quiet pond. My father, lying in a hospital bed, barely conscious, suddenly decided to sign over everything to the one son who barely visited him? Mr. Henderson's eyes dropped to his hands. He folded and refolded a tissue like he was trying to fold away the whole business. "I can't say for certain how it happened, Walter. All I can show you are the documents and the notarization. It was witnessed and filed in accordance with the law." "It was witnessed," I echoed. The word felt like a bad joke. Witnesses aren't supposed to turn a man's life upside down. They're supposed to confirm his last wishes, not invent them. I thumbed through the pages again, slower this time. Legalese has a way of hiding things in plain sight, the way a shadow hides a crack in the porch. There were initials in places my father's hand never wrote, margins where handwriting fell like a stranger. I noticed small things, an odd abbreviation, a stamp with a date that didn't match the hospital logs I could recall, and the more I looked, the more my blood chilled. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. "I think you should talk to your brother," he said, like the words were a bandage he didn't want to peel off. Talk to him. The suggestion landed and turned in my stomach like a coin. I thought about that porch light, about Dad's last look across the field, about his fingers in mine the night he'd asked me to promise. Talk to him? A laugh rose in my throat that felt like it could split me. I left his office with a file under my arm and a quiet storm building behind my teeth. On the way back to the truck, I found myself counting the steps on the sidewalk, small tasks to keep the panic from crawling all the way up my throat. I drove home slowly, radio off, and for the first time since Dad's funeral, I felt an anger that wasn't soft around the edges. It was sharp and bright like the first cut of a saw. At home, I sat on the kitchen chair and looked at the papers again. The house smelled like the lemon cleaner Mom used to keep under the sink. There were stains on the table where fruit had sat for decades. I ran my thumb along the margin of the will until it smudged. The ink left a faint streak on my skin like a bruise. I thought about the visits, Frank's polished suit, the way he'd laugh and pat Dad on the shoulder and promise he was taking care of things. I thought about the business cards he'd left on the counter, neatly stacked like pieces in a chess game. I remembered the night on the back steps when Dad asked me to promise against greed, and the little nod Frank had given that I couldn't read. My first reaction was disbelief. My second was a quiet, careful suspicion that settled like dust over everything. You don't accuse family lightly. You don't call the locksmith for a door that hasn't been tried yet. But the seed was planted. Something didn't smell right. So I did what I always did when something was broken. I started to look. I pulled the file apart, looked at dates, at stamps, at the notary's mark. I wrote down names. I made cold, careful lists. I called a friend who still worked at the hospital. Old habits make old favors, and left a slow, harmless message. I wasn't ready to confront Frank yet. I needed facts. I needed proof. Talk to him. No, I was going to do a lot more than talk. I remember pulling up the long driveway like it was a foreign country. Hayes Valley felt a world away as the road opened into manicured lawns and a fountain spitting sunlight like it owned the morning. Whoever said money can't buy taste hadn't seen Frank's place. It was new brick, tall windows, a porte-cochere that made the mailbox look ashamed. He'd turned the old family name into something glossy and neat. Polished shoes, polished smiles, polished lies. I parked my truck on the gravel and sat for a second, hands on the wheel, breathing in through my nose like I was trying to slow the beat of my heart. I'd rehearsed what I'd say 100 times on the drive over. I imagined anger tearing out of me like a storm, and imagined stomping through his front door. I pictured the look on his face. What I hadn't pictured was the way his front door opened and Frank was there wearing that same damn grin he'd always used to make trouble feel like a party. "Walter," he called, arms wide like I'd been welcomed home after years at sea. "How's my baby brother?" He said it loud enough for the fountain to echo back. He stepped down the marble steps and wrapped me in a hug that felt like a photograph, staged and warm but hollow at the center. He smelled like a cologne that cost more than my truck. He smelled like success and forgetting. My blood seethed under my skin, the quiet kind of heat that doesn't show outwardly, but hums like a live wire. I kept my face. You learn over the years that the best poker face you can have is calm. Anger is a thing people bet on and lose. So I smiled the way men in small towns smile when they see a storm approaching, politely and with a plan. He guided me inside like some host showing off a prize. Everything in that house was arranged like a catalog. Art with price tags in my head, couches that swallowed you whole, glass shining so bright I could see my reflection and my regret. He poured himself a drink, whiskey, neat, and the way he held the glass, the slow turn, that satisfied exhale when the first sip hit, all of it looked practiced. The very air around him was staged. "You know how it goes, Walt," he said, leaning back in his recliner as if the chair had been waiting for him all its life. Dad wanted the business in capable hands. The way he said capable sounded like a verdict. like he'd pointed to the scales and declared himself the better choice. He chuckled like this was a family anecdote, like it was a joke between brothers. His voice had that polished cadence like it had been sanded down to charm. Capable hands? I snapped before I could temper it. The word came out sharper than I expected. You mean greedy hands, he smirked. There it was, that thin, practiced curl of his mouth that had annoyed me since we were kids. The smirk that said he'd just gotten away with something and knew it. The smirk that had once been harmless when he took credit for a science fair project I'd actually finished. Harmless then, deadly now. He didn't even flinch. If anything, the smirk widened like an invitation. Come on, Walt, don't be dramatic. Dad knew what he was doing. He trusted me. He knew I could get things in order. I let the silence sit there like an uncomfortable guest. I could feel my jaw tight. I could feel the rush of years. Fences I'd mended, winters I'd shoveled, nights I'd sat up with Dad, stacking behind my sternum like a weight. I wanted to throw the papers at him. I wanted to shout and break his expensive lamp. I wanted to hurt him the way he'd hurt me, but I'd learned that men like him didn't crumble under theatrics. They crumbled under evidence, so I played a part I'd been practicing in my head the whole way over, the wounded, grateful brother. You're right, Frankie, I said, letting the words fall out soft and calm. Maybe Dad did what was best. He looked pleased, like I'd given him absolution. He took another sip and leaned forward to pat me on the shoulder, the kind of pat that says they're all forgiven. I felt the hand and I smiled on the outside while I was sharpening the inside. Inside, the wheels were already turning. I'd never been much for loud revenge. It's easier to get noticed that way, and being noticed makes people defensive. Oh, yes, I wanted the kind of revenge that was surgical, precise, irrevocable. Proof. The kind of thing that would strip the shine off his suits and leave his name smelling like ash. I started taking notes in my head the minute I walked into that house, names, faces, the way his assistant came in and out, with a folder, like she lived on the edge of busy, the little plaque on the credenza with a lawyer's name and a firm printed in tiny letters. The framed photograph of him shaking hands with a man whose smile was perfect and whose eyes hid something else, small things that people with everything often leave lying around like breadcrumbs. After coffee, which he drank with a practiced half-smile and a story about a meeting, I let the afternoon stretch, asking idle questions about property taxes and estate planning. He answered with that easy charm, all confidence and light. Each answer was a tiny thing I filed away. The date of an appointment, the name of a notary, the story about a final review he'd told the lawyer that one Saturday. The casual details were his undoing. People who scheme often leave a loose thread. When the conversation loosened, he stood and went to the bar to pour another drink. I took that moment to look around more carefully. The housekeeper moved like a machine, polishing a vase with a practiced hand. A smart speaker in the corner blinked like an unlabeled witness. I noted the brand of his phone lying on the coffee table, and without making it obvious, I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out a little recorder I'd bought online. Old habits of proofkeeping. Old Lopez had once told me, if you expect trouble, keep a tape. It felt childish to hide a recorder like some paranoid old man. But this wasn't childish. This was necessary. The smirk he wore had lit something in me I'd thought long dead. A need for vindication that wasn't satisfied by shouting. I wanted every smug sentence recorded, every offhand lie, every phrase that made a man with a decent name think small. Frank came back with the drink and caught me looking at the recorder. His eyes flicked down quick as a hawk. For a second I thought he'd notice, but he didn't say anything. He raised his glass like a toast and said, "To family." "To family," I echoed. And I meant it in a way I hadn't in weeks. I stood up to leave not because I was tired, but because I needed space to breathe and think. As I walked to the door, Frank called after me, casual as ever. "Look, Walt, if you ever need anything, you call me. Family first, you know." That smirk again. Almost an apology and an ownership all at once. I smiled at him and stepped out into the sunlight. The fountain tinkled as if nothing had happened. The sky looked the same, but inside the clock had started. This wasn't about a fight. This was about getting the truth to do the damage. The smirk had started my revenge, not because of what it was, but because it showed me who he really was. And once you see that in a brother, you don't unsee it. You plan, you wait, you collect the proof that'll make a town that once cheered him turn its face. I climbed into my truck with my hands steady. I drove away with that little recorder sitting heavy in my pocket and a plan forming in the back of my mind. I was going to do this the slow way, the right way. Not with shouts, but with facts. Not with fists, but with truth. Not to tear him down in anger, but to expose him so cleanly the world would have to look away. I didn't go loud. I went slow. Quiet. Like a storm that gathers without thunder. Just wind at first, then pressure, then the kind of rain that strips paint. First thing I did was what I always do when something smells wrong. I followed the paper trail. Paper doesn't lie. People do. I pulled Dad's medical folder from the stack of things in the attic. Old charts, appointment cards, sticky notes with prescriptions in Dad's messy scrawl. But I wanted the official stuff, the kind of record that can't be faked with a shaky hand and a good story. So I drove back to the hospital. I'd worked there years, maintenance foreman, so I still knew the faces in the records department. I walked in like a man who'd been there 100 times and asked the nurse at the front desk for access. She hesitated, hippe and all that, so I flashed my old badge out of habit more than hope. It's funny how a little familiarity opens doors that are otherwise bolted. They didn't hand me everything at once. It was a process. Forms were signed. Questions answered. In the end, I sat in a quiet room with a stack of charts that smelled faintly of antiseptic and old paper. I scanned the entries for that week. Vitals, meds, anesthesiologist notes. There it was, in black and white where ink is supposed to be most honest. 9:00 a.m., 5:00 p.m., under general anesthesia for coronary artery bypass. Patient unresponsive. IV sedation initiated at 8:30 a.m. The chart had initials, nurse notes, times logged by the book. My hands got cold when I saw the notarization date on the will, 11:15 a.m. My father could barely speak at 9:00. He certainly couldn't have signed anything at 11:15. Someone had either forged his signature, or they'd brought a notary into the room while a loved one was sedated. Both ideas made my skin crawl. That was my first real proof. Not enough to bring someone down, but enough to make me stop pretending this was a misunderstanding. The kind of proof that gives you permission to look harder. Next, I turned my eyes to Frank's trail. He'd always been careless with the things that weren't supposed to matter to him. Old passwords, casual messages, the kind of arrogance that thinks a little charm covers every mistake. I'd watched him leave his email logged in on my father's computer more than once, and I knew his taste for shortcuts. So I started there. Digital crumbs. I didn't hack. I used what he left open. An old backup drive my father kept had a PDF of correspondence between Frank and a junior lawyer. Names I didn't recognize at first, one called M. Coleman Eskerer. The subject lines were clinical but damning. Revised will draft, urgent notarization, payment upon approval. The body of one email made my stomach drop. Frank wrote, "We need this finalized next week. Wire for 5 kli to cover notary and expedite." There were timestamps, IP addresses, and time zones. Someone had been in a hurry. The more I read, the more reckless Frank sounded. He treated the will like a transaction, not a legacy. He signed off emails with flippant lines, things you only say when you think no one's counting. But people count. That's what I'd learned. I also found drafts, versions of the will with different bequests, each slightly more skewed in Frank's favor. One draft still had my name listed. The next did not. The cursor history showed edits and comments, little notes like add clause for transfer clearance and confirm notarization on 11/15. It was the kind of careless record that only an arrogant man would leave. I kept a copy of everything, not because I trusted myself to hold it in my head, but because evidence needs to be stored like grain, dry and safe. I printed emails, saved PDFs, and slipped them into a folder I locked in my glove box. I made duplicates and sent them to a friend in town who owed me a favor and knew how to keep secrets. But paper and email alone aren't courtroom ready. I needed someone who could speak to handwriting. I needed an expert who could tell a judge that the R in Robert didn't have the same curl as my father's, and that the pressure on the paper matched a different hand. I called a forensic document analyst. They're the kind of people most folks only see on TV, but they exist, and they love this work. the slow, meticulous kind that makes patterns show themselves. The analyst came by my kitchen table, clean, cup rings, a bit of toast crust on the counter, and he handled my father's old documents with a kind of reverence I didn't expect. He compared signature after signature, wrote notes in a tiny, careful script, and then looked up at me with that small, professional smile of someone who knows the answer before you do. Forgery, he said, plain as a fact. The stroke patterns don't match. Pressure inconsistent. This signature has tremors that aren't typical of your father's steady hand. Looks like someone tried to mimic him. It was validation, the clinical kind that turned my gut suspicion into something a prosecutor could hold. I asked about the notarization stamp, the timing. He said the stamp itself could be real. A notary can sign a lot of things if someone sets it up right. But the signature, no. It didn't belong to my father. That gave me two things: a path forward and a decision. I could call the sheriff, hand everything over, and watch men with badges try to untangle years of contracts and meetings. Or I could set a table where the town could see the menu. Greed served cold, with receipts. I chose the latter. If Frank was going to be taken down, I wanted it done in a way that made sense to everyone who'd ever believed his smile. I wanted him to lose not just the land, but the standing that let him buy respect. I wanted the town to know he'd traded our legacy for profit, so I kept digging. Small moves now, larger ones later. I found bank transfer records tucked into a scanned folder, a wire to an out-of-state notary on 1114 cleanup payments to a private courier, a deposit flagged as expedite. I cross-checked names. I called names. I left polite messages that sounded like a man trying to reconcile accounts, not the sort of calls a defendant might return. I met with my old friend at the paper to ask about whether a local reporter might be interested in an estate irregularity. I listened and let them think I was simply another grieving son looking for answers. When you dig, you get dirt. But you also get roots, old loyalties, sloppy mistakes, people who blink when asked a direct question. Each one narrowed the circle. Each one tightened the mesh until there was no place left for Frank's story to hide. I still hadn't called the sheriff. Not yet. I was building the kind of proof that made sure when the law came knocking, it wasn't just a rumor it carried in its pocket. It was a case with edges sharp enough to cut through excuses, and I was patient. I had the land, the memories, and the stubbornness of a man with nothing left to lose but dignity, and I wasn't giving that up. By the time I slid the last printed page into my folder that night, the house felt colder, less like something that belonged to a man who farmed and more like a courtroom. I locked the folder away, breathed out, and let the first small, satisfied click of progress settle over me. The world had tipped, but I was steady now. The hunt had begun in earnest. There's a power in pretending you're broken that men don't often respect. People lean in to help a wounded dog. They step back from one that bares its teeth. I learned to wear my wounds like an old coat, ragged at the cuffs, comfortable to anyone who wanted to see me as harmless. It's an underused tactic, but it works because pride is a liar and smugness is its own undoing. So I played dumb. I called Frank like a man with nothing left to lose. "Hey, Frankie," I'd say, putting weakness into the vowels. "You got a minute? I'm having trouble with taxes. Dad left so much paperwork and I don't know where to start." I let my voice quiver on purpose, like age and grief had finally blurred the edges of my mind. I sent him texts full of little things. Questions about bills, who the accountant was, whether the farm's insurance was up to date. I asked about loans, about maintenance crews, about whether he'd taken care of the old tractor. Each question sounded like the puzzled circling of a man who'd lost his map. He swallowed it. Hook, line, sinker. Frank loved rescuing people. He fed on the look of someone offering a hand. He wanted the town to see him as the son who stepped up. It fed his narrative, and more importantly, it fed his ego. Every time he answered, I filed what he said away like coins. Small metallic truths you can spend later. "You always were the soft one, Walt," he said on one call. Laughter like a coin dropped into a fountain. "That's why Dad picked me." It was exactly what I'd been waiting for. Confession wrapped in condescension. I didn't argue. I let him pat me on the head, give me solutions I could apparently not manage, and hang up with a sense of satisfaction. That satisfaction was poison for him, and I was salting the wound. While I played the fool, I was recording everything. Not in a melodramatic way. No grandstanding, no dramatic reveal mid-conversation. I carried a small digital recorder in my jacket pocket, the sort you don't notice until you need it. I recorded phone calls when state law allowed it. I recorded in-person conversations when he was loose with his words. You'd be surprised what men say when they think they're talking to an idiot. Smugness strips off filters. I kept a strict method. Each recording was dated, time-stamped, labeled with context. If Frank mentioned a name, I marked it. If he bragged about expediting paperwork, I made a note. If he hinted that a notary had been paid or that someone helped make everything smooth, I circled it in my mental ledger. I never raised my voice. I never accused. I let the recorder capture the arrogance and the small admissions while I kept my face like a tired pillow. But recordings and rage aren't enough. You need credibility, and in small towns, credibility is often held by the press. That's where Maggie came in. Maggie, who'd been my high school lab partner and later a reporter at the Kansas Tribune. She'd always had a stubborn streak, the kind that makes you follow a story long after it stopped being convenient. When I called her, I didn't ask for a favor. I told a friend that something smelled rotten and asked if she'd have a look. Maggie came through. She listened like a pro, no theatrics, just questions that cut to the bone. She wanted documents, dates, notary stamps, witness names, bank transfers. She wanted leads. I handed over the hospital chart, the drafts of the will, the emails I'd found, and the analyst's report that had called the signature a forgery. I told her about the wire to an out-of-state notary, the odd courier charge, and the junior lawyer who'd suddenly become very eager. Her eyes went small when she looked at the evidence. "This is big, Walt," she said, voice low and steady. "If there's even half of this true and we can verify the rest, people are going to want answers." We started building the case quietly, like two people gathering stones for a foundation. She used the paper trail to dig deeper, subpoena-style questions no one outside the press can ask without raising suspicion. She checked public records, called the notary listed on the paperwork, and found a string of expedited notarizations that led to a courier company and then to a post office box in a town 2 states over. She talked to the junior lawyer listed in the emails. The kid fidgeted and admitted he'd been asked to prepare final drafts quickly, but swore he hadn't known about the hospital schedule. It reeked of convenience. There was a rhythm to our work. I'd gather, she'd verify, I'd follow up on a lead, she'd corroborate. We used sources who would speak off the record, former employees who'd seen Frank's hand moving fast and felt the chill of the smell of money. We found a bank transfer flagged as notary fees that cleared into an account with a name that matched a man who, when confronted, claimed he'd cashed a check from Frank for miscellaneous expenses. The pieces started fitting together in a way that made my stomach tighten. But from the beginning, I had a particular theater in mind. If we were going to expose Frank, we needed to do it where his audience could see it, where the same people who applauded him every year would be forced to look at the evidence. That's why I bided my time and why I let him parade his smugness. It gave the reveal traction. It gave the truth an audience. Frank's annual charity gala was the perfect stage. He loved that night. The tuxedos, the speeches, the applause. He basked in it every year. It was a harvest of public affection he'd cultivated with donations, gallery openings, and a biography that didn't mention how he'd clawed his way up. The town's elites would be there, the very people who'd trusted his handshake, his endorsements, his promises. If anyone could make him fall from grace, it was them. So I planned. Maggie agreed to be our conduit to the public, but she also knew the danger of blowing a story without ironclad proof. We rehearsed the reveal like actors practicing blocking. She would hold the line with the paper, the analyst's statements, the bank records. I would bring the human face to it, the brother who'd been left out. We timed everything for maximum effect, the projector, the flash drive, the audio. We'd have emails up on the screen, bank transactions on the slide, and audio clips of Frank's own smugness playing under the headline. Real people, real times, real names. It felt ugly, plotting against your own blood. But there's a difference between ugly and unjust. He'd made his choices. He'd courted applause while steering a sharp knife into the back of his own family. I told myself over and over that this was about more than land. It was about truth. If he could sell his soul for a ledger entry, he could be shown up for who he was. I also built contingencies. I made sure copies of everything were with Maggie and a trusted attorney. I set up a burner account where digital files could be uploaded and kept safe. I told only a handful of people who wouldn't spill. Revenge done in the dark can look like spite. Revenge done with witnesses looks like justice. On the day of the gala, I'd be there, not crashing, not shouting. I'd be calm, a man who had been gentled by loss and honed by purpose. I'd watch the room swell with the same applause that had once been a warm blanket. Then, when Frank raised his glass and gave that speech about legacy and family, we'd pull the curtain back. I felt like a gambler waiting on the river card. Everything I'd gathered, the signatures, the emails, the bank transfers, the audio clips, would have to turn a night of celebration into a courtroom of public opinion. There was a risk, of course. People who love their myths don't always love corrections, but the truth doesn't care whether you like it. It just wants to be known. So I practiced my blank face some more, patched up my story for Maggie's intro, and locked the folder where I kept the originals. I washed my hands and folded my jacket the way you fold things you intend to wear with purpose. The plan was in motion. That smirk had started the fire. Now I was going to fan the flames at the one place where he thought himself safest. The gala would be the stage. The town would be the jury. And when the lights came up on the evidence, there'd be no hiding behind charm. I drove home that night feeling lighter and colder at the same time. The work had begun to feel like building a bridge. Steady, deliberate, and impossible to destroy once it was finished. I slept like a man who'd finally found something to do with his anger. The reveal would come soon, and with it, the reckoning. The ballroom looked like a magazine spread. Chandeliers dripping light, tables dressed in white linen, centerpieces high enough to hide half the room. Men in tuxes checked their cufflinks. Women in gowns laughed like little bells. The air smelled of perfume and expensive cologne and the faint, greasy sweetness of past hors d'oeuvres. Waiters moved through the crowd like practiced shadows, balancing trays of champagne that caught the chandelier light and threw it back in little bright knives. Frank was in his element. He stood at the podium with that easy smile, the one that said he'd been born for applause. He talked about service, about giving back, about the importance of legacy. The crowd ate it up, nodding, wiping away little emotional tears for PR, applauding when the right line landed. It was a performance he'd rehearsed 1,000 times, a script that made him look heroic. People loved to believe their benefactors were saints. I sat in the back of the room where the shadows pooled and tried to breathe like a man who had no stage fright. My suit fit, but it felt like armor. In my pocket, the flash drive was heavy as guilt. It was small, stupidly small, but it carried the whole thing: emails, scanned documents, the analyst report, and the little audio clips where Frank's voice sounded exactly like the smug man I'd known my whole life. Maggie sat 3 rows up, eyes steady. She had the look of someone about to pull the ripcord on a blindfold. When Frank thanked everyone and raised his glass, the clinking began. The orchestra softened to a murmur. The room hung where it always hangs in those moments between speech and applause, teetering on a phrase, expecting the familiar release. That's when I stood. I felt every eye find me the way a compass needle finds north. People who'd never known me leaned forward. Cameras pivoted. Frank's smile paused. For a second, the music still breathed, and the room waited to see if this was some planned bit. A surprise, a roast. He looked at the staff near the stage, then at me, confused, then irritated. I walked up the aisle like a man walking into his own verdict. My sneakers clicked softer than I thought they would against the polished floor. I felt ridiculous and perfectly in place all at once. When I stepped onto the stage, the orchestra stopped. The hush hit like cold water. "Evenin', folks," I said into the mic, letting my voice find a calm I hadn't known I had. "I'm Walter Hayes, Franklin's brother. Some of you might remember me. I was supposed to inherit half of Hayes Valley, until someone forged a will." The sentence landed like a thrown stone. It broke the polished surface of the night and sent ripples across the room. A woman dropped her napkin. A man swore softly. Glass chimed once, then fell quiet. For a moment, the only sound was someone's chair scraping back in panic. Frank's face shifted. The practiced smile faltered, then thinned. He took a step forward as if to intercept, to laugh this off, to call me a dramatist. Instead, he froze mid-phrase, his mouth working like a man who's been handed sudden bitter news. I didn't give him the chance. I reached into my pocket, found the flash drive, and slid it into the laptop on the podium. Maggie had set everything up with a look, her hand under the table steady as a metronome. The projector hummed, blinked, and then threw Frank's emails across the big screen in letters big enough for everyone to read. At first, there were subject lines: revised final draft, urgent notarization, payment upon approval. Then the scanned will, the rushed signature, the date stamped right in the middle of my father's surgery. I played the audio clip, a small, quiet thing, and Frank's voice filled the room, not the flattering public voice, but the offhand, smug tone from my recordings. We'll make it smooth. Wire it, and I'll handle the rest. No one needs to know. He'd said it like it was a business deal, like we were arranging chairs at a banquet and not robbing our own blood. The room went sideways. Conversation stopped mid-sentence and then fell into shards of whispers. Phones came up like a tide. Someone started recording. Someone else stared at the giant screen like it was a train wreck you couldn't look away from. Faces I'd known my whole life, neighbors, parson, local bank president, morphed from pleasant to something else. Betrayal sits on a person's face like a new hat. It changes the silhouette. Frank tried to speak. He reached for the mic, but the stage manager, a man paid to keep order, stepped between us like he'd been taught to do just that. Frank's hand brushed the manager's shoulder. The touch was brief and jerky. His jaw clenched. He opened his mouth and closed it again. He stuttered something about mistaken context, about old drafts, but the words were thin. People don't have much patience for excuses when the proof is beating them with its own rhythm. A ripple of outrage traveled the room. Someone shouted, "You lied." Another voice called, "Is this true?" A reporter in the corner stood up, camera waving like a flag. An older woman in pearls began to weep, not theatrical but real. That kind of public disbelief makes you small, or it makes you exposed. Frank's posture collapsed a degree. The smirk that had started everything fell like a mask being pulled off. He lunged at me then, maybe to grab the flash drive, maybe to grab the mic, maybe to grab anything that could salvage a sentence. Security moved in, and for the first time in years, his charm couldn't butter anyone up. A burly man placed himself between us, his hand firm on Frank's elbow. The crowd parted. Electricity crackled. Frank's face went white. He barked orders, "Get them out, now!" And his voice had a wild edge I'd never heard. He wanted to make it look like I'd ambushed his party, like I was a vagrant upsetting an evening. But the projector kept roaring, proof after proof. Emails, bank transfers, courier receipts, a scanned copy of the notary's check. Each new slide made his protest smaller. The mayor, who'd spoken only minutes earlier about community and trust, sat with his hands folded, looking at the screen as if answering a riddle he wished wasn't his. Someone called for his assistant. Phones were everywhere now, the gallery of public life recording everything. "Frank," I said, looking him dead in the eye, and the room leaned in like a crowd at a confession booth. "You didn't just steal land. You stole a legacy. You stole Dad's voice when he couldn't speak. You sold our history for a ledger and a smile." He looked like a man who'd lost his map. For one terrifying heartbeat, the man I'd called brother was nothing but a stranger. Frightened, small, human. Then he reached for his phone with trembling fingers and called his lawyer, whispered and frantic. The lawyer, who'd been laughing with guests not 10 minutes before, straightened like a man bracing for bad weather. Cameras flashed. Someone shouted that the police were being called. Others argued that this should be settled in court. I felt no joy in that moment, only a slow satisfaction that truth had breached his armor. The applause that had been waiting for Frank a half hour ago had turned into something else. Murmurs of betrayal. The rustle of alliances shifting. Security gently escorted me off the stage after a staffer demanded I leave for disruption. Maggie slipped me a handwritten note as I passed. "Hold, we've got coverage." "Don't sign anything," and her eyes were wet but steady. Outside, the night air was colder than it had any right to be, but it felt like the clean part of a storm. When I walked out that back door, I heard people talking about subpoenas, about donations being frozen, about rescinding endorsements. I heard Frank's voice behind me, hoarse now, begging, bargaining, promising something he could not promise. The orchestra started playing in the distance, a single dissonant chord. All those years of pretending he was better were gone in an instant. The man who'd smiled and smirked and charmed his way through life had been exposed in front of everyone who'd ever cheered for him. I had expected anger. I had expected denial. What I hadn't expected was how quickly the crowd would divide, how quickly friends would distance themselves, and how quickly the veneer of respect would chip away. As I made my way to my truck, flash drive secure in my jacket. I felt the world tilt again. Not the shallow tilt of grief, but the deep, inevitable turn of a wheel that's been set in motion. This was the night. The reveal had happened. What came next? Investigations, legal battles, fallout was a new horizon. But for that one breaking moment in the ballroom, truth had taken the stage and it had the loudest voice. I woke up to a buzzing I couldn't ignore. My phone, the kind of noise that tells you the whole world is spinning without you. It was early, gray light leaking through the curtains, and for a second I thought maybe I'd dreamed the gala. Then the screen lit up. Missed calls, text messages, an alert from Maggie. Turn on the TV. I shuffled to the living room, coffee forgotten on the stove, and turned the set on. The same footage I'd left on the projector was playing on every channel. The chandelier, the photograph of the will, that plain clip of Frank saying, "We'll make it smooth." A banner ran across the bottom of the screen. Local businessman accused of forgery and fraud. My name scrolled in one corner, Walter Hayes, brother of Franklin Hayes, like a label for the moment. It hit fast. Within hours, the town that had once congratulated Frank on his donations was abuzz with a different word: shame. Reporters I hadn't seen in years called for statements. Someone uploaded the gala footage and it went viral in a way small towns don't often see. The kind that feels like a sudden storm, catching everyone off guard. Investors started pulling back before lunch. I watched the news tickers show statements from companies that had once proudly partnered with Frank. "We are reviewing our relationship," said one. Another released a terse press release. "Pending investigation, all new funding is suspended." The bank where his accounts had been held issued a cold public notice. Accounts under investigation. Certain assets temporarily frozen. It reads clinical on paper, but in practice it's the kind of thing that makes a man's life thin as tissue. The notary, the one whose stamp had sealed that rushed signature, was the first to crack. He came forward the next morning like a man who'd been waiting too long to breathe. In an interview, he confessed to being paid to notarize an expedited estate document and said he hadn't verified the circumstances in the way he should have. He named names, stumbling through the details like someone pulling a loose thread that unraveled the whole sweater. When the notary spoke their name, it was like someone turning on a light in a room you thought you'd already searched. Word spread to the sheriff's office. An investigator I'd once fixed a heater for called me, gentle but blunt. "We're opening a formal inquiry. Mr. Hayes, we'll need copies of anything you've got." I handed them the folder, the scans, the emails, the analyst's note. I felt strangely calm. Evidence has a way of making things real in a way that anger alone never does. Frank, meanwhile, turned frantic. He called my number 10 times that day. 10 missed calls, little windows of insistence flashing on the screen. My phone buzzed with texts pleading for meetings, for explanations, for mercy. I didn't answer. There's a mercy that comes from silence. If he wanted to talk and explain, the courthouse would be the place for that, not my front step. His last voicemail was the worst kind of small-town sound. A man who had always believed applause could fix things finally out of it. His voice trembled in a way I'd never heard. No smirk, no practiced charm, only panic. "You ruined me, Walt," he said, breath hitching. "You ruined everything I worked for." The words were thin and pleading, like a coat that no longer fit. I listened to it once, twice. I held the phone to my ear and let the silence stretch after the message ended. Then I whispered into the quiet of my kitchen, where the sun pooled on the table like an honest coin. "No, brother, you ruined yourself." It wasn't triumph I felt. It was a heavy, clear thing. The knowledge that he had chosen his path and now was walking the consequences straight into the town square. People began to change their routes. Neighbors who used to wave now looked away when our trucks passed. The country club rescinded his membership privileges. The church released a short statement about stewardship and integrity. A cousin I hadn't spoken to since the funeral called to say she was saddened, and then quickly, awkwardly ended the call. That kind of social frost spreads faster than any press release. You can feel it in the grocery line and how long someone will stand and chat on the porch. It was a funeral for his reputation and attendance was high. I didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in watching a brother fall apart. What I felt was a strange, disciplined relief. All the work had been ugly and necessary. The truth had been the instrument. The town's reaction was the echo. Justice, or the nearest thing to it, was in motion. There would be subpoenas, depositions, courtroom lights. There would be long days where every private thing would have to be recounted under oath. That's the part that makes your stomach hollow. Truth clears the air, but it also lays everything bare. Maggie's piece ran that noon, clean, careful, and damning. She'd held back the juiciest bits until she could corroborate, and people respected her for that. She quoted the analyst, the bank's statement, and the notary's confession. She didn't sensationalize. She presented a paper trail and let the town judge for itself. Her byline read like a salve. Maggie O'Reilly, the Kansas Tribune. I called her to thank her, and we spoke in hushed tones about the next steps: civil suits, criminal inquiries, and how to protect what remained of the farm until the law sorted everything out. Lawyers arrived on both sides. Frank's defense began to massage the narrative, claims of misunderstandings, of bureaucratic errors, of bad timing. But the documents we had were tight. The analyst's handwriting report was a strong piece. The sheriff's office took depositions, interviewed the notary, and subpoenaed the courier company. Each call, each signature, each tiny delay we'd uncovered began to look less like coincidence and more like a plan. In the town, conversations shifted from pity to anger to something quieter, a resolve to know the full story. People I'd have never expected to show interest in legal minutiae called me asking if they could help in any way. It was strange to be the center of something that felt so much bigger than me, but also right. They'd loved the Hayes name because it came with community gardens and Thanksgiving turkeys. They were angered now because that name had been used to fool them. The community's betrayal felt personal to a lot of folks. I understood that. Hayes Valley had always been a shared thing. Frank's numbers dwindled. A featured sponsor announced they'd be returning a donation. A pricey development deal that had been rumored for months was put on indefinite hold. The banks froze accounts connected to the estate while auditors took inventory. People who'd once stood beside him at ribbon cuttings were suddenly deciding their own angles. The social texts I received were polite but clear. We need to protect our interests. Lawyers call that risk management. In human terms, it's friends walking away. There were quieter hits, too. The guy who'd fixed my fence for years told me he didn't feel comfortable doing odd jobs for the Hayes name anymore. The high school coach who'd always pulled for Frank stopped returning calls. It's not just money that leaves when trust is broken. It's the small kindnesses that once filled the space between people. That felt, in a way, harder than any headline. At night, when the city lights were distant and the field was quiet, I would walk out by the old oak and listen. The land didn't care about bank accounts or notary stamps. It only knew the rhythm of rain and seed and sun. That steadiness was a kind of consolation. The fight might end up in court, but the fields would still need tending. There were chores as ever: fencing to mend, a spring to check, the old tractor that groaned when you turned the key. Work is honest in a way headlines are not. I'd be lying if I said I didn't think of Frank as a human being in that rubble. We'd shared a childhood. We'd fished the same pond. There were memories that weren't colored by greed. But choices matter. He made his, and they had consequences that spilled into neighbors' bank accounts and into the trust of a town. So while the morning brought cameras and subpoenas and frozen funds, it also brought clarity. The cloud had split and the light revealed how wide the damage had been. The law would take its course. People would judge. Families would reconfigure. And in the middle of it all, I sat in my kitchen, the coffee gone cold, listening to the faint drone of a news segment and whispering again to myself, not with malice, but with a hard lesson learned. No, brother. You ruined yourself. The seasons turned the way they always do, steady and indifferent to the noise of men. The wheat grew tall again. The wind found its old rhythm across the valley and the courtrooms went quiet. What had started with a forged signature and a smirk ended in a stamped verdict. Hayes Valley was mine again. Legally, rightfully, finally. It took months to get there. Lawyers argued. Auditors double-checked everything. And I spent too many mornings sitting outside the courthouse, sipping burnt coffee from a paper cup while reporters waited for a quote I never gave. Truth doesn't need headlines. It just needs time. When the judge read the decision, I didn't feel fireworks or cheers, just relief. The kind that seeps in slow, like exhaling after holding your breath for a year. Frank didn't show up that day. His lawyer spoke on his behalf, muttered something about new beginnings and amicable closure. I just nodded. I wasn't looking for vengeance anymore. The fight had already taken enough out of both of us. A month later, I drove down that old gravel road to the property, the same one I'd ridden my bike on as a boy. The sign that once read Hayes Valley, private property, had rusted around the edges, half buried in weeds. I pulled over, ran my fingers along the worn wood, and smiled. "You're home again," I said under my breath, though maybe I was talking to myself as much as to the land. The farmhouse was still standing, tired but loyal. The porch sagged a little. The paint had peeled down to gray bones, and the shutters hung crooked like they were squinting against time. But I saw what it could be. I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. Morning by morning, I scraped, nailed, sanded, and painted. I fixed the roof Dad once patched during a thunderstorm. I planted young oak saplings along the fence line, the same kind Dad used to call time markers, trees that would grow long after we were gone. Maggie came by sometimes with lunch and iced tea, said the place smelled like redemption. Maybe she was right. When I repainted the old fence, the one Dad built with his own 2 hands, I made sure to use his favorite color, barn red. The same shade that used to stain his boots every summer. The boards creaked but held firm, and when I finished the last post, I stood back and looked across the open field. The sun was dropping low, throwing gold over everything. For the first time in years, I felt peace, not victory, not triumph, just peace. Sometimes I'd sit out back on that creaky porch swing with a cup of coffee, watch the wind ripple through the wheat, and think about all of it. The betrayal, the anger, the long road back. It wasn't just about land. It never really was. It was about respect, about keeping promises, about not letting greed rewrite what family built with sweat and decency. Frank? He moved out of state last I heard. Arizona, maybe. Bought a small place somewhere quiet near the desert. I don't hold hate for him anymore. Hate's a poison you drink thinking it'll hurt the other guy. I just hope he found enough silence out there to listen to himself. Really listen. Every now and then, a letter shows up. No return address, just a few lines written in shaky handwriting. "Hope you're taking care of the valley. Walt. Dad would have been proud of you." I never know for sure if it's him, but I keep those letters in a small tin box under the porch. They're reminders that even the ones who fall can try to find their way back. Now every sunrise feels like a second chance. The land breathes again, and so do I. The fences stand straight, the oaks are growing strong, and when the wind runs through the fields, it sounds a lot like forgiveness. Betrayal doesn't always arrive loud or bloody. Sometimes it walks right up to your porch, smiles, and calls you brother. It shakes your hand, looks you in the eye, and tells you everything's fine, all while holding the knife behind its back. That's the thing about betrayal. It's quiet before it hits. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It doesn't break the door down. It finds the spare key you left under the mat. When I look back on it now, the letters, the lawyers, the nights I couldn't sleep, I don't think about revenge the way I used to. Back then, I wanted to hurt him the way he hurt me. I thought justice meant watching him lose everything. But I learned something far deeper. Revenge isn't about destruction. It's about restoration. It's about standing up straight when the world expects you to crawl. It's rebuilding what was broken, brick by brick, even when your hands shake from the effort. When Frank stole the land, he thought he took everything I had. My father's legacy, my purpose, my pride. But what he didn't understand was that strength doesn't live in deeds or bank accounts. It lives in how you respond when everything's taken from you. So if you've ever been betrayed, listen close. You don't have to scream. You don't have to fight dirty. You don't have to burn every bridge to prove a point. Let time and truth handle the heavy lifting. Because truth, when it finally shows its face, doesn't need a spotlight. It walks into the room steady and undeniable, and it does what no anger ever could. It settles the score clean. That's what my father meant when he said, "Don't let greed break what I built." I didn't understand it then, but I do now. Greed might win the moment, but integrity wins the years. These days, I sit on the porch of that old farmhouse, coffee in hand, and I watch the sunrise spill across Hayes Valley. The wind carries the smell of wheat and wood, and I think of all the storms that came and went. The land stands, the trees grow, and the truth remains. Because truth, my friend, is the loudest revenge of all.